panel of the series here. This panel is going to be chaired by Dr. Steve Blank. Earlier I had talked to you about Dr. Denny being the newest member when we started the conference, the newest member of SSI. Dr. Blank has the distinct privilege of being the most senior member of SSI, and therefore he gets to finish up and close out the conference with his panel of experts on gangs, guns, and it used to be ganja, but now we came up with something else. So it's
gangs, guns, and grass.
And I will pass it off to Dr. Blank.
Thank you, Trey. It's my pleasure to host the last panel here. We're going to be talking about a species of threat that has not been prominent so far. That is, on the one hand, the sub-state threat, or the subnational threat, as some have called it. But we're also going to be talking about the use by states of organized crime and insurgencies and terrorist groups in third-party countries to advance their own strategic and geopolitical aims. So we're going to be talking about organized crime, but we're also going to be talking about the linkages between organized crime, sub-state movements, and state sponsors. Now, all of you know that there are state sponsors of terrorism and other nefarious activities out there, and we are going to get a pretty good idea of what they are doing and what those activities are and how they threaten U.S., if not international security, and raise the issue of what role, if any, does land power play in dealing with this phenomenon, whether it be Latin America, Africa, or other parts of the world, because these are global manifestations. We have a superb group of panelists. Their biographies are in the book that you all got. They will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes each, and after that, we will take questions. So we will proceed. Ed Lucas will go first, Karen Saunders second, and Douglas Farah third. Ed?
Well, thanks very much indeed, Stephen. It's an honor to be here, and I hope that if I don't tell you anything you don't already know, at least I may be able to help you think about it differently. It's quite a difficult business talking about Russian organized crime, because one of the things that Russian gangsters have learned is that they can sue. They can sue in English courts for libel. They don't have to live in Britain, and they can sue you for something that you say in America. And having spent quite a lot of time in my day job at The Economist dealing with this issue, it makes me a little bit cautious. Some of you may know the controversy that's been going on in Washington in the recent weeks about the Magnitsky list. This is a list of people involved in what appears to be a criminal conspiracy to steal $230 million from the Russian taxpayer, and the murder of the whistleblower who found it out. And the legislative branch is trying to have the people involved in this banned from coming to the United States and having their assets frozen. And everyone talks about this quite freely in Washington. What many of you may not know is that the guy who's been campaigning on this, the guy Bill Browder, who's the motive force in the campaign on Magnitsky, he's being sued in London by one of the people on the list. He's being sued with a very expensive British law firm doing the legal action. It's an interesting question how a humble Russian policeman can afford one of the most expensive law firms in London. But that's not much comfort when you're being sued. So I'm going to apologize in advance that I can't give you the names, the incidents, the precise linkages that you might like to have in illustrating the points I'm going to make. I'm very happy to talk back afterwards, and I'm in the opposition of a journalist of saying I'm happy to talk on background. It's normally the other way around. But I am extremely grateful that as a sort of heaven-sent peg for my talk, that there was a very good bit of news yesterday from Finland, which revealed that none other than Vladimir Putin himself was on the Finnish police watch list for organized crime. Now, it's very interesting why this came out, and of course the Finnish police then denied it and said it was quite, it's just a mistake. But the fact is, he was on the list. It was leaked, and I thought that rather helpfully exemplified the way in which at least the suspicion of organized crime, however unjustified, can reach even the highest levels of the Russian government. I want to talk to you about two shifts in thinking, which I think are overdue. One is a conceptual one, which is that soldiering, land power, military force, has nothing to do with gangsters. And the other one is that is a geopolitical one, that we need to worry a lot more about Russia than we did. I've only got one slide here. I hope that the typeface is not too small. You're welcome to come and sit close to the front if you want. It's in my presentation, which I think is downloadable. And if anyone wants to email me, I'm edwardlucas@economist.com, and I'll send you a high-resolution copy. You can also follow me on Twitter, and I'm going to tweet it as well. I'm @EdwardLucas. So these are the two conceptual shifts. One is the military criminal overlap, and I go into this in a bit more detail in my paper. But where do you get, as an honest soldier aiming to fight your country's enemies, also in uniform, where are you going to bump into gangsters? Well, of course, one is in the supply chain, and I'm not talking about defense contractors here necessarily, but if you're trying to run a base in Afghanistan, you're going to be dealing with people to the north and to the east of you, who perhaps don't operate by the highest standards of business practice. You have the control of territory. We've seen this in Colombia, also in Guinea-Bissau right now, where drug smuggling is an issue. Douglas is going to get onto that in more detail. And of course, we see it in the arms trade. One person I think we can talk about without fear of being sued is Victor Boot, currently enjoying the hospitality of the American government in New York, and Karen's going to get into that in more detail, so I won't go into that in any more detail myself. The other conceptual shift is about Russia, and I think we are still basing our thinking on the 1991 or early 1990s mindset that the Cold War's over and Russia's not a problem. And I've written 2 books to say that this is not the case, and I'll just very quickly, in a couple of sentences, outline what I say in those books, which is that Russia is a revisionist power. Russia regards the 1990s as a time of national humiliation, and they regard the post-1991 settlement as deeply unfair. They regard it as unfair in geographical terms, that they think that the West has pushed into what they regard as their sphere of influence, and they regard it as unfair in terms of Russia's diminished role in global affairs. This manifests itself in 2 areas which may be of interest to those of you who worry about US land power. One is the security of northeastern Europe. I don't know if anyone here has heard of Steadfast Jazz, but that's the NATO exercise, the first NATO exercise in the new member states since they joined the alliance in 2004. And it's to both to rehearse the NATO rapid deployment, but also to show that NATO can do exercises in defending its most vulnerable members, which is the Baltic states, and doing them with the help of Poland. So there's Northeast European security, which involves Russia. And then there's the broader question of decision-making in international forums. And I'm amazed that we haven't seen more discussion about the very substantial setback which America and the European Union experienced at the ITU, International Telecommunications Union meeting in Dubai, where our idea of a free internet, where content is free of government interference, took a tremendous kicking. Now, getting on to the overlap with criminality in Russia. People often say Russia's a mafia state, and that's a very handy journalistic title. In fact, a friend and colleague of mine in London, Luke Harding, has written a book called Mafia State. But talking to professionals in the law enforcement field who deal with Russia, I think that's actually slightly imprecise. It's fair to say that Russia is a criminalized state, and Russia is a state that adopts the methods of organized crime both at home and abroad when it wants to, but it's not a completely criminalized state. An example, I think, of where that term would be applicable, and I'm quoting law enforcement officials here, is North Korea. If you have a country which, as a matter of state policy, prints currency, other countries' currency, in order to finance its operations, or as a matter of policy instructs all its embassies and missions around the world to be self-financing, that's a criminal state. It's very interesting. If you go within about a 5-mile radius of the North Korean embassy in London, there's a rather substantial number of off-licenses and tobacconists and kiosks who sell cut-price cigarettes that seem to come in from France on a weekly basis. And the suspicion has been voiced by British officials that this is the North Korean embassy raising the money to pay its bills. I'm sure that's completely unfounded, and all such allegations are quite untrue, and please don't sue me, but I have heard this said. But I think it is fair to say that corruption is pervasive and ubiquitous in Russia, and organized crime is equally pervasive and ubiquitous and has a very high degree of impunity. This doesn't mean that Russia is run by a particular organized crime syndicate, but I think you could say Russia is run like an organized crime syndicate. And there's some academic literature which goes into more detail on that, and I refer to it in my paper. A good example of these kind of organized crime tactics is the case I mentioned earlier of the Magnitsky fraud. This was an attempt to get an enormous tax refund, the largest tax refund in Russian history, which was paid out in a single day, in fact on Christmas Eve, to a very mysterious bank, which then liquidated itself, and the money then disappeared off to Cyprus and other places. Now, those of you who have experiences of dealing with the Internal Revenue Service in this country, I can assure you that if it's difficult to get tax refunds out of them, it's a great deal harder to get them out of the Russian tax service. And to get the largest tax refund in history in the space of one day gives what, in legal, if you're trying to defend yourself from a libel action, you say gives grounds for speculation and even controversy. So that, I think, is a very good example of how things work inside Russia. But actually, and this is where it gets perhaps more relevant for you, that we see this as part of the way Russia operates abroad too. One thing that you come across is Russian officials and elected officials and government officials may have organized crime backgrounds. And it's no secret there are people in the Russian parliament, the Duma, who have had previous prosecutions for organized crime, and who then will be on delegations that your elected representatives will be meeting in international forums. There's a more substantial problem when it comes to international law enforcement, and I've come across two cases where you've had, with major American criminal justice involvement, activities in countries in Europe directed against Russian organized crime. And in both cases, the country concerned has quite reasonably gone to the Russian embassy and asked for help in tracing mobile phone numbers, passport details, the usual kind of police cooperation. In each case, the information concerned has been leaked directly to the gangsters who this operation was against. That's quite a serious problem. We see it very much in the cyber world, that the Russian cyber warfare doctrine is partly based on using botnets and disrupting things with botnets. And of course, where do you buy botnets? You buy them from criminal gangs. Zero-day exploits, again, and I'm not saying Russia is the only country to buy zero-day exploits from the criminal world, but they're certainly a major purchaser and developer of those. We see it in the world of money laundering. In the world of energy, it's absolutely astonishing to me that we don't have more scrutiny of this, and of course the libel laws in Britain may be one reason, of the way in which energy intermediary companies that own no pipelines, no reserves, own really nothing apart from their excellent connections, make billions and billions of dollars trading in Russian oil and gas. I think it's very important to realize that Russia doesn't think in precise categories. And when they look at the world, they see a toolbox. Is this a problem we should address through diplomatic means, through military means, through political means, through economic means, through energy means, through cyber, through espionage, or through organized crime? Crime is part of the toolkit. Where you might get this, for example, is in collection of information using criminal gangs that have access to information about how things work in the country. It can also be in the exercise of threats or even carrying them out. And I live in a city where a number of quite prominent Russians have died mysteriously, early deaths in recent years, or have been the subject of assassination attempts that were unsuccessful. I'm very much looking forward to your questions, particularly if you don't ask me any specifics, so I won't answer them. But I want to finish up just by asking you to, this is an excellent conference, and all the questions are very well phrased and so on. This isn't the way that Russians look at it. We are not dealing with Russians who say, what does this mean for Russian land power? They think, what does this mean for Russian power? And we, as I say in my piece, we don't want to copy their approach, because we have a system that's based on the rule of law, on the difference between business and politics and crime fighting. These are all separate categories. But that's not the nature of the adversary we're dealing with. They see a spectrum of approaches. They use the one that will work or the combination that will work. And if we try and counter that, simply by using the nice, precise categories that we've grown up with, we will lose. And I'm afraid at the moment we are losing. So on that cheerful note, I'll finish and look forward to the rather more expert and academic contributions of my colleagues.
Thank you, Ed. We'll now hear from Karen Saunders.
Thank you. Thank you for a great introduction to exactly why Russia matters still. I'll be taking us a little bit more in depth into one of the ways in which crime becomes part of the toolkit, which is what Edward had said. We're going to talk about the airborne illicit trade from the Soviet successor space to Africa. And I do want you to internalize the title of my talk, which is New Generation Proxy Warfare, ? The airborne illicit arms trade to Africa involving Soviet successor states. Could I have the, thank you. And I will not discuss this slide. It's my disclaimer and research questions for you to internalize while I'm opening. This topic piqued my interest in 2009 when I began working on a project that was using open sources to better understand the nature, scale, and scope of transnational crime networks and terrorist organizations in post-Soviet Central Asia. We had a particular focus on the role of illicit trade networks, including trafficking in arms, drugs, and humans. However, the reporting requirements of the project began to stifle the research findings. I think we've all found ourselves in that situation. We were tasked with discussing and reporting only on illicit trade in the immediate Central Asia region. I and another analyst found ourselves fettered to Central Asia while the research was taking us elsewhere, from post-Soviet Central Asia and the former Soviet Union to Iran, Yemen, Syria, the United Arab Emirates, North Africa, the Horn of Africa, West Africa, Venezuela, Cuba, Colombia, and the United States. This was back in 2009, so I want you to think about these areas in 2013. Although this part of our research was unfunded, we continued to follow the illicit trade networks out of Central Asia in an ambitious after-hours hobbyist research project that continues today. I'm glad of the opportunity to share with you some of these findings today, along with some analysis into the deeper implications of this airborne illicit arms trade from the former Soviet Union to Africa on US national security interests and American land power, the focus of this conference. For the purposes of brevity, I have limited my discussion to illicit trade specifically by air, as opposed to overland and maritime routes. Air into Africa, of course, there's a land power implication once it gets to Africa. Illicit trade in arms, as opposed to in drugs, humans, minerals, and that sort of thing, and illicit trade routes to Africa, although I would like to underscore that the story does not stop there, and indeed continues through to other areas of the world that I mentioned earlier. The first slide in my presentation is behind me of the analytic spectrum. My discussion today will adhere to the 4 categories of analysis depicted in this graphic. First, if you can see descriptive analysis in the lower left-hand corner, I will look at the anatomy of the contemporary airborne illicit arms trade from the former Soviet Union to Africa, the who, what, when, where, and how. Second, I will examine the motivations behind the airborne illicit arms trade from the former Soviet Union to Africa, the why in that explanatory analysis section. Is this illicit arms trade motivated by economics, greed and profit, politics, both, and or some other factor or set of factors? And finally, I will discuss what these motivations indicate about threats to US strategic interests and American land power. What does it mean, and what may happen next? Now turning to the description of the airborne illicit arms trade from the Soviet successor states to Africa. While it's impossible to share all the details of this phenomenon, I would like to mention that this analysis is based on original, primary source, open source studies of roughly 3 interconnecting and overlapping networks operational in 2009 and later. In other words, this group of networks does not include the Victor Boot network, which my co-panelist Doug Farah literally wrote the book on, but I think Doug and those of you in the audience who know about the boot arms trafficking network will hear some familiar information. So let's start with the who. The networks we analyzed are led by ethnic Russians who had grown up in or had extensive living experience in post or Soviet Central Asia, which is what I call a pan-Soviet upbringing. They have educational and professional backgrounds in civil or military aviation spheres. Cities where they received post-secondary education, which is really important in a Soviet context, included St. Petersburg, which has particular political importance in today's Russia, and Pyatigorsk, which has particular significance in the world of Soviet intelligence and military education. Additionally, we were able to substantiate business linkages among network leaders and former ruling elites in Central Asia and influential business and political elites in Russia and Tajikistan. The support personnel, the pilots and crew, are generally ethnic Central Asians whose Muslim culture and identity give them particular credence in the Middle East and parts of Africa. Facilitating individuals include government officials in the network's 3 operating environments. I'll discuss the operating environments later. The supply side environment, which is the former Soviet space, the transshipment environment, which is the United Arab Emirates, and the delivery environment, which is the African continent. Moving on to the what. While I was unable through open source to obtain a picture of arms on an aircraft that I knew to be associated with these illicit arms trade networks, my analysis remains that arms is at least one type of illicit trade that these networks are involved in. A review of relevant academic literature on the illicit arms trade in Africa, UN reports, journalistic accounts, and civil society investigations underpin this. Facts we uncovered support this analysis. These include, but are not limited to, 1, at least one of Victor Boot's specially equipped aircraft, as well as other suspect aircraft previously owned by Victor Boot and other arms trafficking networks, are still in operation and are now in possession and use by these networks. 2, crash reports, incidents of flight crashes, indicate that aircraft failed to land safely due to their overweight cargoes. There was an underreporting of the cargo weight carried by these flights. And 3, we gleaned an awful lot of information about these networks, the who, the what, the where, et cetera, from social networking sites related to these networks, along with open source social networking forums. Further, although when we're talking about the what, although I don't want to depart too far from the arms trade itself, our analysis suggests that the illicit commodities trade provided at least one method of payment for these arms from the African continent, which should be of no particular surprise. We uncovered one link between one of the networks and a timber export company operating out of Cameroon. In other words, arms in, timber, coltan, minerals out. When? This is a short section of my paper. The activities of these particular networks were ongoing as of 2012 and appear to have begun in the early 2000s, although we started researching them in 2009. Where? In my paper, I described the 3 environments for this airborne illicit trade. One is the supply side environment, where the arms come from. This is the former Soviet space, and in our research features flights from Kyrgyzstan and arms from the Russian Federation and other post-Soviet Central Asian states. 2 is the transshipment environment, the layover en route to Africa, where shipments are warehoused and or consolidated for delivery as necessary. This environment, in our example is the United Arab Emirates of Dubai, Sharjah, Ras Al Khaimah, and Fujairah, where these Kyrgyz companies are headquartered. UAE is an ideal choice for transshipment. It's abundant, and welcoming free trade zones are exploited by these networks for their policies of what happens in the hangar stays in the hangar. Very little oversight mechanisms, very few mechanisms, and even less enforcement of these mechanisms. Further, UAE's burgeoning commodities markets, which they're developing at a very fast pace, provide an ideal way for these networks to launder the payments made in kind in conflict minerals and other natural resources, such as timber and coltan. And third is the delivery side environment, which for the purposes of this discussion is West Africa, North Africa, and the Horn, including Somaliland, Libya, Sao Tome y Principe, Sudan, Guinea, Cameroon, and other countries. These are countries where these networks are specifically and documented working. I will, however, underscore my statement again that the story does not end in Africa. Turning to how, for the sake of brevity, I'll mention several machinations necessary to sustain airborne illicit trade networks. One, acquisitions of retired civil and military aircraft from Soviet successor states at rock-bottom prices through corrupt privatization schemes, outright thievery, and the like. Two, access to supply chains of arms and weaponry systems through military criminality in Russia and the Soviet successor states. Graham Turbeville Jr., who used to work here, has done a lot of work on Russian military criminality in the 1990s, and I would suggest those of you interested to look up his research. Three, use of Cold War era transport routes and corrupt relationships that were active since before the collapse of the USSR. Four, the choice of the transshipment environment. Five, deceptions in tail numbers of aircraft to allow for anonymous flights. Six, document falsification, which includes end-user certificates and bills of lading when they're even asked for. And seven is relationships with facilitating individuals. So we're moving now from our descriptive analysis to our explanatory analysis. Why? Why does the airborne illicit arms trade to Africa continue to flourish? The facts are telling us that the story is changing with respect to motivations behind this trade. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the illicit arms trade was mainly a frenetic open season depletion of the Soviet Union's weaponry stores by whomever had access to them. There were three basic types of individuals who worked in the illicit arms trade during that period. One was these one-off sales by lowly military guards at an installation. Two was loosely coordinated illicit sales by transnational crime networks who had partnered with government officials. And the third was even illicit backdoor arms sales by Russia's bona fide arms export companies, Vozoruzhenia and Vayentech. Now the landscape has changed. And I argue that motivation has changed as well. The why is changing. Russia has moved from this Wild West period that we all remember in the early 90s to Putin's famous vertical of power, vertikal vlasti. A resurgent Russia under Putin means that security at military installations and weapons warehouses is far more intact. Access to supply chains is therefore much more limited, and fewer individuals are in a position to access these supply lines. Random and decentralized trade structures have given way to a massive, coordinated, controlled, illicit arms trade. Profit and greed are still motivating factors, but in a different way. They motivate the leaders of the illicit arms trade networks. However, these network leaders are no longer in control of the industry. They have been subordinated to the role of a broker. The illicit arms trade from the former Soviet Union is allowed to exist and flourish at the express knowledge and support of criminalized states in the region. So what does this mean, and what happens next? We're moving to those next levels of analysis that I promised you. What does the issue of motivation imply about the threat posed by the airborne illicit arms trade to U.S. strategic interests and American land power? We must explore the hypothesis that the illicit arms trade to Africa is manipulated as an element of statecraft, which relates to Doug's work, or a new form of proxy warfare carried out by criminalized Soviet successor states against U.S. strategic interests in areas of conflict. The United States military services have recently increased their focus on ungoverned spaces and conflict zones in Africa that have become convenient outposts for Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, their affiliates, and other terrorist groups. If we're going to have a boots-on-the-ground presence in Africa, we need to know about the operating environment. The illicit arms trade from the Soviet successor states to Africa provides a backdoor to arms and munition acquisition for these hostile non-state actors, as well as embargoed African governments, dictators hostile to the U.S. interests and those of its allies. As such, these networks undermine and threaten U.S. efforts to bring stability, peace, and development to this critical region. In order for U.S. efforts in Africa to achieve maximum results, U.S. government and military leaders require a deep understanding of the roots, methods, and especially the motivations of post-Soviet illicit arms trade networks in Africa. And we must explore means to address this phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And we now turn to Doug Farah, who is, if you've been following these subjects, is a recognized expert, and as Karen said, wrote the book on Victor Boot, who is now enjoying the hospitality of the federal government in Manhattan.
Well, thank you very much. I tend to speak very quickly, so if I go too fast, wave your hands, and I'll try to slow down. I'd like to focus on Latin America as a section of the world that does not get a lot of attention in the focus of the U.S. intelligence community and in thinking in the U.S. military community. I'm a recovering journalist. I left the Post almost 10 years ago now and do most of my work for the U.S. government and looking at over-the-horizon threats and other things. And I'd like to echo what the general said this morning, that, and I hope that what the presentation will show is you really are dealing with incredibly complex and rapidly moving situations. That's one of my primary hypotheses. And the second is the emergence of this class of criminalized states that we're seeing certainly in Africa, but across places much closer to the United States, across Latin America. The groups self-grouped into the Bolivarian Alliance led by Venezuela, but including Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and now on the verge of joining them is Argentina, which I think provides a host of new challenges for us. The emergence of these criminalized states is a significant game changer in the hemisphere and in how the world is now operating and how we have to view our doctrine and our approach to these places. Why, and I'll use a crude analogy, I think is particularly in Venezuela, but certainly in the other criminalized states, what you hear a lot, particularly in the law enforcement community, is now you have all of these groups, Hezbollah, the FARC, everybody in one grand alliance against the United States with state sponsorship. I think that's essentially not true. I would say that a crude analogy is that Venezuela essentially has built a bar where almost anyone can go and pick anyone else up, either for a one-night stand or a committed relationship, depending on how it goes at that particular time, and whether there's mutual benefit to be derived from a continuing relationship. It doesn't mean, if you see, as we have recently, the FARC doing direct business with Hezbollah, that Hezbollah and the FARC are necessarily allied. It means that they have found an environment in which they can assess the convenience of carrying out those transactions on a transactional basis and go forward with them and either repeat them or not as the circumstances require, as long as there's mutual benefit. But I think overlying the development of the criminalized states, and I speak as having grown up in Bolivia and lived through the military dictatorships and other things, was not against the Bolivarian Revolution in its inception on ideological grounds. I thought it would actually perhaps be an interesting experiment as Latin America had gone from military dictatorships to chaos, the neo-liberal models of democracy that didn't work so well, and then this was the new wave. Unfortunately, it turned out to be, I think, probably the biggest disaster that the hemisphere has faced. But on top of that, you have this alliance with Iran. And when I was asked to speak on the asymmetrical aspects of what I view as this threat, and it comes from primarily from the Iranian connection. I covered the wars in El Salvador. I don't know if any of you were there, the wars in Nicaragua, the wars in Africa, and I learned early on as a journalist that one should take and read very seriously what one side is saying about the other and what they're going to do, especially Marxists. They love to write everything down, and they write it down in great detail, and then they set out to do it. And we have consistently, through the years, not taken them seriously enough. So as I began looking several years ago, because it struck me as one of the strangest alliances I had seen. You have the Bolivarian Revolution, which describes itself as 21st century socialism, allied ever more closely with a reactionary theocratic regime that had virtually, there's no language affinity, no cultural affinity, no religious affinity, nothing. And I began, and the conventional wisdom was, and I think largely remains in the intelligence and the US analysis, is this is basically a minor anti-US irritant designed to stick us in the eye, go, meh, you can't do anything about it, and irritate us, not as a real threat. And I would argue that that is fundamentally a flawed analysis. I think one of the, so I began reading back into what the late, great Hugo Chavez used to say on, he was giving his weekly addresses for hours and hours on the radio, but one of the things he liked to do was describe what he was reading. And so I began to think, okay, if he's talking about these books, maybe someone should take a look at them and see what they actually are. At the same time, I was doing a lot of work on the Iranian side of the equation. And having lived through the wars in Central America, one thing that always struck me as very strange, and that came into focus in this particular crossover, was the affinity of the Sandinista revolution for the Iranian revolution. If you recall, maybe you don't, some of you are too young to remember this at all. When Ortega took power with the Sandinistas in 1979, one of the first things he said was, the Iranian Revolution and the Sandinista Revolution are twin revolutions. We share the same goals, doctrine, etc. I was like, that's a strange concept for a revolutionary movement with this theocracy. And I began to think about, okay, what is it that binds these things together? And I read for the first time, not a couple of years ago, the Iranian Constitution, translated English, and what's really striking is that they tell you in the preamble exactly what the alliance is. And it goes back to a seminal event for both the Bolivarian Revolution and the Iranians, and that is the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The Iranians view it as a theological event, right? Allah smote the infidels and provided great victory for the Muslim world. The Bolivarians look at that and say that was a model of asymmetrical warfare of how to defeat the United States, and something that we should emulate and we need to build on. The Iranian Constitution says in its preamble, with due consideration for the Islamic element of the Iranian Revolution, which has been a movement by the victory of all oppressed peoples who are confronted with aggressors, the Constitution shall pave the way for the perpetuation of this revolution within and outside the country, particularly in terms of the expansion of international relationships with other Islamic and popular movements. The Constitution seeks to lay groundwork for the creation of a single world nation and to perpetuate the struggle to make this nation a reality for all the world's needy and oppressed nations. Interesting. Hugo Chavez could have written that statement as what the Bolivarians would say. So I began reading back, and the first book that I came across that Chavez was a big fan of was a book written by Carlos the Jackal in 2003 after 9/11, and it's called Revolutionary Islam. He wrote it in prison. He was, as you know, on the militant Palestinian conflict for many years as a Marxist, went to prison, converted to Shia Islam, and wrote this book where he posits that asymmetrical warfare against the United States and against the West, it was mostly a north-south thing in his construct, is allowable. The asymmetrical warfare is necessary, and the use of weapons of mass destruction is a natural consequence of that right to confront the oppressor. And he goes on in great detail, and it's shortly after this was out, it became public that Hugo Chavez had a long-standing pen pal relationship with Carlos the Jackal in prison, which Chavez has acknowledged. He's ordered his ambassador to get the jackal out of prison because he's a Venezuelan citizen, bring him back to Venezuela, etc. This is part of one of the letters that Hugo Chavez wrote to Carlos the Jackal. Swimming in the depths of your letter of solidarity, I could hear the pulse of our shared insight that everything has a due time. Blah, blah, blah. You may choose a proper fight, lying outright for your principles at a time you choose for proper fighting, laying in wait with a keen sense for the moment of truth, etc., etc. And it's like this long love letter. And he ends up, I feel that my spirit's own strength will always rise to the magnitude of the dangers that threaten it. This is Chavez. My doctor has told me that my spirit must nourish itself on danger to preserve my sanity in the manner that God intended, with this stormy revolution to guide me to my great destiny. With profound faith in our cause and our mission now and forever, Comrade Hugo. So you can see that there's something of an intense relationship there. And so I thought, well, that's a really interesting construct to build a relationship around. And then I came across a little book that was written by a Spanish academic named Jorge Verstrigne that's called La Guerra Periférica y el Islam Revolucionario, Peripheral Warfare and Revolutionary Islam, Origins, Rules, and Ethics of Asymmetrical Warfare. And why I came across it because Hugo Chavez, hardly anyone had read the book, it's a very difficult book to read, had brought Verstrigne to Venezuela in 2006 to give a 4-day class to his entire General Officer Corps to explain to them the necessary steps in asymmetrical warfare against the United States. And if you read the book, what's really chilling about it is he takes Carlos the Jackal's work and then goes one step further and says asymmetrical warfare has to be based on the use of weapons of mass destruction to destroy the United States. Not only do we have the right to it, but it is our obligation to carry this forward. And I'm thinking, that's a pretty bold statement, right? Chavez liked the book so much that he had it printed up in this little pocket-sized edition for all of his officers to carry around. You can see the Venezuelan flag in the front, Venezuelan flag in the back. They carry it around and they study it, and this now has been adopted by the FARC. So you have Chavez in this unusual position of bringing Iran into the region, which then bring Hezbollah into the region, while he's being the chief state sponsor of the FARC, which is the oldest revolutionary movement in the Western Hemisphere, begun in 1964, now producing about 90% of the cocaine produced in the United States. It's one of the few organizations that is designated both as a drug trafficking organization and a terrorist organization by both the United States and the United Nations. And so you see the new proxy warfare as you see Iran move in, you see not only the Quds Force and the IRCG folks move in, but you see this relationship establishing between, there are now documented cases of it. If you haven't ever had a chance to look at it, there's a great operation called Operation Titan that is now declassified. I had the privilege of working on it before it became public, where they laid out over a period of years the FARC selling cocaine to Hezbollah in Colombia and the laundering, and then through Central America as well. A lot of the dope was going to the Sinaloa and the Zeta cartels in Mexico, and from there, how they laundered the money through Cameroon, through West Africa, through Europe, through the United States. Most of the money eventually flowing back to Lebanese Canadian Bank in Lebanon, which is one of the Hezbollah's chief financial institutions. When Treasury finally took action, began to threaten to take action against the Lebanese Canadian Bank, it collapsed. It just simply collapsed overnight because they couldn't sustain that they were not an Iranian front. So as you look across the panorama, my assessment is this is not a statement of capability, but it certainly seems to be a relatively clear statement of intent. And as you go forward and look at what they're doing, you can see how the motions are going through. And so what someone said this morning, I think, I remember what country they're talking about, they've done things to us, Korea has done things to us twice, and we have not responded. I think the same thing is true if you look at Iran. Very little was made of this when it happened in 2007, but you recall there was a plot to blow up JFK Airport by lighting the natural gas lines under the air terminals on fire and blowing up, killing thousands of people. That case was tried in New York, and the public record of that case shows clearly, by the admission of those involved, that that was an Iranian plot. It was funded by Mohsen Rabbani, who ran the Latin American network for the Iranian government, who was also responsible for the Amia bombing in Argentina in 1994, sending money to a mosque in Guyana, which was then used to fund this. And it's all laid out in the court documents in great detail, which no one was aware of because The case publicly was tried that these guys wanted to blow it up. It's an act of terrorism, sent to jail. They were Guyanese and from Trinidad and Tobago. The Iranian connection didn't surface and didn't make much waves. That made me think, okay, here we have the Iranian government putting money into an attack on the United States, and we didn't even mention it. Okay, interesting. Follow that with the 2011 attempted attack of Iran trying to hire a person they thought was a SETA to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington. The person they contacted was, in fact, a DEA informant. He wasn't a SETA, and as we were discussing earlier with a colleague from Northcom, I don't think it tells us anything about the SETAs, because the SETAs, I don't think, would have done this. But it tells you a great deal about the Iranian intent, because they deposited $100,000 in the account of the person who's supposed to carry out the attack to make it happen. If you're willing to put $100,000 into an account, you believe there's at least a chance it will succeed. What was our response? Essentially zero. But what's our magical thinking, and this is what I'm constantly amazed of in my work in the government, we have this magical concept that they won't cross the border. They will never do anything in the United States. Well, they've tried twice that are a matter of public record. There, I think, are other things in the classified realm that indicate that this is not isolated events. And I think that we have to get our head around the fact that since 1979, Iran has essentially been at war with us, and we have not paid attention to it. And as they look forward is where they want to go, what is their interest in Latin America? And what do you see them doing? Few specific, I've written extensively if you want details on what they've done in Venezuela with the financial structures and things. There's a lot of information out there, their bicycle factories and their car factories and their tractor factories, their massive use of money. But I think primarily what they're looking for are two things. One is a positioning to be able to carry out attacks like they attempted in those two instances, and as a defensive possibility in case the United States or Israel were to bomb their nuclear facilities. The extraction of minerals, I myself do not believe uranium is one of them, as others have said, but there are specific minerals that are very useful to their missile program, which they are extracting. And I think on a broader level, and this goes particularly to one country that we routinely and continually ignore, Ecuador. And is to break holes in the sanctions regime that the United States and the United Nations has put on them. Why Ecuador? Because it has a dollarized economy with a Bolivarian government where the president himself has designated specific Ecuadorian banks to work with Iranian banks to break the embargo. There's a case, I just wrote a case study that I was allowed to publish on a little bank called Kofiak Bank. In January of 2012, Ahmadinejad visited Quito. He sat down with Correa. We have the minutes of the meeting, which is why we were able to write this. And he said, Ahmadinejad says, we would like a bank. And President Correa says, I have a little bank in state receivership that's not doing much, Kofiak Bank. Why don't you take Kofiak Bank and use it? Now, he came out afterwards when the story, because there were some investigative journalists in Ecuador that initially did the story. They said, oh, this is a few rogue people. No, it was the president of the country who sent as his delegate to negotiate with sanctioned Iranian banks. First, they went to Moscow. Why Moscow? Because it's the only country where you have banks that have corresponding bank relationships with Iranian sanctioned banks. So they went to one of those banks, set up correspondent relationships, which means in Ecuador being a dollarized economy, you already have dollars. You don't need to do any exchange rates. You can deposit the money in, move it through accounts outside of the banking structure. You can transfer it internally in this lovely Russian bank. Then they flew to Tehran and negotiated with 4 sanctioned Iranian banks over how to make all this work. And some of the communications are really wonderful. In one case, one of the Iranian banks, Saderat Bank, says, how about if we establish communications with you using an encrypted telex and we keep the decryption key in the Iranian embassy in Ecuador so that you can read what we send to you. Not a normal banking relationship, I would say. Another little interesting case, these are just little anecdotes, and I'm about to wrap up here. 2012, March 2012, and I just found out about this, and there is some open source reporting on it, because a friend of mine who works the piracy issues on the Horn of Africa said, what about the Bolivian ship that was seized carrying Brazilian sugar to Iran? I said, Bolivia, one, we don't have a coast, interesting, but they can flag ships. And he said what was really interesting about it was that it was a Bolivian ship, an Iranian ship flying a Bolivian flag, carrying supposedly Brazilian sugar, taken by pirates. Iran sent special operations forces to board that ship, execute the pirates, liberate the ship, and free the sugar. And he said, for sugar? Really? Are you kidding me? The point being, and then finally, they have recently discovered the first shipments that I'm aware of Iran directly shipping RPGs to the FARC in Colombia, which is another dangerous element. And the FARC, after years of trying, now has its first surface-to-air missiles, one of the things that we always thought would be a game changer. I think that in this environment, you have to say, okay, what's going on here and why aren't we paying a little bit more attention? It's not like you're dealing with Suriname or Guyana. You're dealing with real countries, with real economies who have control over and access to our main shipping lanes, access to places like the Panama Canal, access to other things with an explicit and declared intent to do us harm. And I think looking across that panorama, you see they can do this because they have state-to-state transactions. When Iran ships something from Venezuela on one of its ships to Iran, there's no customs inspection. Nobody's going to say, oh, that might be illicit. It's illicit because between two states that agree it's illicit, and that's all you need. And that's why I think criminalized states who are willing to traffic in dope, as Venezuela does, multiple other things, you have a significantly different environment than what you had prior to that. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Doug. I'd like to remind everyone that we are only touched on the tip of the iceberg. This kind of stuff happens not only in the third world. Just to give you an example, which is, again, open source, it was reported last year that since 2010, 38 flights of Ilyushin 76 transports have taken off from Podgorica Airport in Montenegro, loaded with weapons, flying to Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia, which is one of the world's hotspots. And if that explodes, of course, it'll be a major regional crisis. So this kind of thing is universal. It's not confined to Africa or Latin America. That said, we're now prepared to take questions from the audience and from those people who are watching us on streaming video. If you have a question, as before, please stand up, identify yourself and your affiliation, and then pose the question to the member of the panel. And the same is true for our streaming video audience. Any questions? General Kukolo.
Tony Kuklo, any panelists, all panelists. I'm trying to think of, is it the police, is it the military? What should be the, if we were to establish relationships with the intent of elbowing out, changing the propensity of security forces to participate in these sorts of things. As I ask the question, I realize it's complex, it's country and region specific. I got it. So, but maybe you could just shed some light on that. If we were to begin an effort, here you go. If we were to begin an effort, rack and stack the countries in South America, Central and South America, that you would recommend we engage in priority, perhaps, your opinion. And then same for Central Asian states or those states around the region where we could, where could we make the greatest inroads in impacting the propensity of security forces to participate or condone, turn a blind eye to this sort of activity? Anyway.
Who wants to go first?
I'll go first if you want. I was wrestling with this in writing the paper, what the role of land forces, because I really liked what was said at lunch, small and many versus few and large. I think I do a fair amount of work with SOCOM, and I think one of the things that stands out in that is that we are developing more of a capacity to think in smaller terms about how to shape the environment and influence events. And I also think, I think the General said this morning, I think one of the keys in this is it has to be a whole of government approach, because in things like this, particularly looking at the Bolivarian states, the people who have had the most, who can do the most damage most quickly to our adversaries are people like the Treasury Department. If you were to exclude Ecuador from the Western world's financial structure, which we have ample grounds to do and have chosen not to, you would collapse their international structure. I think the people who've been at the forefront of identifying the overlap between the FARC, drug trafficking organizations outside of Colombia, and Hezbollah, it's been DEA. If you look at what we can do and what people, and I spend a lot of time down in the region, what people would like to see us do is engage much more, I wouldn't say aggressive, or broadly, much more focused on people that we think we can work with. And I would say, I mean, clearly, if you're looking at friendliest to engage with, clearly the most important one is Colombia, because they're there, they're trained, they're ready to go, they're teaching security elsewhere. And while we don't do nation building very well, I would argue that Colombia is probably the one exception, largely because they assumed it as their own issue, put their own resources into it, and move forward. Second, I say it has to be Mexico. You know, you can't have security on our border without our southern border being secure. And I think that the relationship between the transnational criminal organizations operating out of there into across our borders and down south have created a situation of enormous instability in Central America, where we're facing the very real prospect of not having a narco state, but a narco region. Where you have El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama, all teetering on the brink, if not already gone, from any concept of the rule of law. This is a little different from the criminalized states. As was said earlier, this is where the state directly directs things. Mexico, I think, and Central America is still the old model. Narcos are looking for specific elements of state that they need to corrupt for their own benefit. They need a judge. They need a border crossing agent. They need a policeman who will look the other way, and a banker who will take their money. That's different from exercising state power. So I'd say that those are the two that you'd want to engage with on a friendly level. I think there are ample people across Central America that one could engage with if one chose to do that. I think Chile is enormously important. I think Brazil is going to be, in South America, the game changer, and I think they're in the balance. I think that they have their own working assumptions about what they want to do as an emerging global power. They have the Olympics and the World Cup coming up, which is beginning to radically shift their attention toward transnational organized crime and the possibility of terrorism, something they have hitherto paid very little attention to. I think we could encourage and work with them much more closely. So yeah, I guess that would be in that region.
Ed?
Yes. Looking at the region around Russia, I think that there are countries that have long experience of dealing with Russia who we could learn from, and probably help more in their fight. And I think the Baltic states, in different ways, have all got very good capabilities. The Estonians on cyber and on psychological warfare, the Latvians on anti-corruption, dealing with Russian organized crime, Lithuanians developing a capability on nuclear smuggling, the Poles, very wide range of capabilities of dealing with Russia. I think we need to do a better job in setting standards in our own allies, and it's a source of great alarm to me that you have the penetration of state structures in NATO countries, and I wouldn't say this is just a problem for new NATO members, it's old NATO members as well, but the penetration of state structures by criminal networks and stretching from banking and finance through to energy and other places. And I think there's sometimes not enough pushback. We tend to think if these are friendly countries, we can't lecture them. In a way, that's right, but on the other hand, they can't stay friendly forever if they don't adopt our standards. So I think we need to have better sort of internal policing. And then I also think we've got to encourage everybody, both ourselves and our allies, to think outside, not even think outside the box, just to break the box altogether. And again, some of the countries in the region are very good at doing this. If you talk to the Estonians, they'll say, this is partly a finance thing, so we have the central bank and the finance ministry involved, we have our counterintelligence service, we have our intelligence service, we have our military. And of course, because it's a small country, it's the same 12 guys, and some of them sort of move around from different office, so they all know each other. But there's a kind of flexibility and resilience that you see in some of these countries that we could really copy. When I was investigating the Russian sleeper network that was rolled up here in 2010, I was investigating Anna Chapman, who's the only one anyone ever remembers, and she was running a business in London, and which, I would be careful how I say it, it certainly gave the impression that it could be a money laundering business that was possibly of use to Russian intelligence. And I was talking to our counterintelligence officials and saying, why don't you investigate this? This is in effect, this is breaking half a dozen British laws. To which they said, our job is catching spies, not criminals. And I said, but the spies are the criminals and the criminals are the spies. It's completely artificial distinction. So long as we carry on making that distinction, it becomes really easy for what I call in my book the shapeshifters, who put on the hat in the morning that they work for Gazprom, in the afternoon they're a gangster, in the evening they're a spy, and overnight maybe they're working they're doing something else. And we can't just expect them to sit in the boxes that we've created.
I'd like to also talk about this issue of breaking the box or thinking differently about the system that is inherent to the way the institution is currently organized. One of the takeaways that I hope you gathered from my presentation is that this is a systemic issue. I gave you the example of Africa, but it's strategic that we understand that these networks come all the way across the world and end up in the US, having traversed the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, the African continent. Of course, there are nodes that go into Western Europe, South America, Latin America, into the United States. We need to develop capacity that can address a transnational systemic issue of this nature. But I also, breaking it down to the Africa level, I wanted to alert everybody to the environment that boots on the ground may enter. This is an armed environment, more armed than licit sales will tell us. And not only is it an armed environment, it's an arms-capable environment. And as the military may pursue interventions or courses of action in Africa, they need to integrate the idea that this is an arms-capable environment and the threat is different than the threat that we see when we look at licit types of arms available on the continent. In terms of engagement points, I have to, of course, say that the fish rots from the head, which is anyone who's been studying the former Soviet Union has to say when you talk about engaging with other countries in the region. But I will say that in terms of Central Asian states to work with, we have a colleague here from Kyrgyzstan, and of the Central Asian states, I would say that Kyrgyzstan has an opportunity now. It has a capacity issue with the changes in leadership and the struggles that it has gone through. But that might be a possible point of entry to work with some of our colleagues from Kyrgyzstan. I think you can find engagement points along this vast system.
We have a question from Major Dan Suchman at the Army Capabilities Integration Center at Fort Eustis for Doug Farah. Quote, regarding Hezbollah's role in South America, is it a direct threat to the homeland or more of a money-making operation?
Well, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think they're clearly engaged in financial activities. I think that if you look at the AMIA bombing in 1994 in Buenos Aires, when Iran blew up the Jewish community center there and killed 85 people, that case has been, the indictment comes from a prosecutor who spent years looking at everything. It's really fascinating because you see the very clear division of labor between the Iranian diplomatic corps, Quds Force, Hezbollah, and Mois, the Iranian intelligence service. Everyone played a specific role in making that attack happen, including the diplomatic pouch to move explosives and all of those wonderful things. It began in the tri-border area, in Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil, where they joined, which is the financial hub, or has been. I would argue that's probably not true anymore. While it's a massive center of smuggling and illicit activity, most of the Hezbollah activity, of the heavy money activity, has moved to Venezuela because they're safer there. They can move their money through banks. They don't have to sit around wondering if the Brazilians are going to wake up frisky one morning and do something, or the Paraguayans might wake up from their siesta and decide it was time to go do a raid. In Venezuela, that's the advantage of having state sponsorship, is that you can be absolutely sure that your interests are protected until the state turns on you, which it occasionally does, but you can operate in this lovely environment of stability. And as any business, listed or illicit, craves, what do they crave? They crave stability. They want predictability. They want to be able to know when they get up in the morning, they can go to their business, nobody's going to harass them. And that's what the Bolivarian states are providing for not only Hezbollah, the ETA's there, all of the little groups of the armed left that never demobilized, which I, having grown up in Bolivia and lived through those years, thought had disappeared, didn't. The MIR in Chile, the Mapuches, the MRTA in Peru, all of those groups, we know they exist because in the captured FARC documents that come out of Raul Reyes' computer, there are all these emails to the FARC saying, help us, we need money, we're doing this for you, can you pay for this? We want a radio station, blah, blah. And when I was helping the Colombians go through them, I was like, really, they exist still? Holy cow. Why do they exist? Because the FARC has cocaine money that they can move through Venezuela with impunity and distribute to this network. So I think, the answer to the question, I think that they can be dual-hatted without any difficulty at all. And when they're tasked with raising money, they will raise money. And when they're tasked with blowing something up, boom.
Are there other questions? Sir? Yes, you. Yes.
Sure, Byron Callan, Capital Alpha Partners. Question for Ms. Saunders. I just wonder if you can comment on, there is a supply and demand here, but how Libya, and I assume a flood of weapons after that conflict was over, and how Syria may be impacting some of these flows to and from Russia and Africa.
Thank you. Most disturbing about Libya and Syria is that the signs were there if you were doing the research. The signs were there in 2009. Yes, Libya had a state-sponsored illicit trade network, which were the Tuaregs coming from West Africa, illicit trade in cocaine, heroin going the other way, this and that. They have an established illicit trade network from West Africa through the Sahara Desert, where there's very little chance of being impeded, through Mali and Niger and Cameroon, and then eventually making its way through Libya at the sponsorship and knowledge of the state at the time, and into Western Europe via Italy, most likely. In terms of Syria, yes, the networks are present and active in Syria. This is, thank you, it's another takeaway. You need to presuppose that any area that may become a theater of action is already more militarized than we might expect, and or is arms capable and arms ready due to links with these pernicious and transnational illicit trade networks.
We have another question from an online viewer. It's for Doug Farah from Lieutenant Colonel Terry Boras. I hope I pronounced that right. She is a student at the Army War College Distance Education Program. Quote, how do you see Hezbollah's proselytizing impacting the disenfranchised groups and youth in Latin America? Have the principles of liberation theology set the stage for success?
I think that's actually a really interesting question. One that I've actually been thinking about as I've gotten deeper into this. I don't think it's less Hezbollah's proselytizing than the use of Iranian cultural centers and others. As you watch them across the region, they have grown exponentially. If you read the Islamic websites that Hezbollah runs across the region, they still tout every conversion as a major event. Douglas Farah converted today, and here's his testimony, which leads me to believe there aren't mass conversions. If you're still touting the ones and the twos, then you're not getting the tens and the 20s. So, and there's very little cultural affinity then. But one of the things that Iran has done is it's set up a 24-hour satellite channel in Spanish to broadcast to Latin America. And the first program it broadcast, and I found this very interesting, was the life of the Virgin Mary from the Islamic perspective. And I thought, now that's pretty smart, because they accept the virgin birth in Islam of Jesus. And it was a clear effort to say we're not so different, right? We have something in common, the Virgin Mary. You're all Catholic, we can agree on something. If you look at how they move through the Islamic, the cultural centers, there are clear recruitment drives. the Univision, the Spanish language network, did a piece about a year and a half ago called the Iranian Threat, which was really good. And it starts in Mexico, where you see a group of students at the National University are recruited by a specific professor who is out of Venezuela to do hacking on behalf, to offer their services. First, they go to Venezuela. They talk to the Venezuelan ambassador. He says, well, you should really talk to the Cubans. This is where you see this really interesting interaction. The Cubans say, you know, this is really cool. You can hack into the United States. Talk to the Iranians. They're the ones who'll really want to use you guys. So they go to the Iranians, and a couple of the guys get very nervous about what they're doing, and then they're techies, so they start putting little cameras in their buttons, and they film a lot of this stuff with the ambassador saying, I'd like you to do this. Can you hack the Pentagon? Yeah, we think we can. Well, that would be great. You know, we'd love for you to do this stuff. But they recruit students through the student movements, and in Central America, they target very specifically the children of the war, teenagers whose parents were killed, most of them who fought on the side of the FMLN. They go into the system, and there's a significant recruitment campaign where they grab up people from across the region and they send them all to Venezuela for cultural events. They get 500 students together, everybody's having a party, and out of that group they'll select 12, 15 people to go to Iran. And everyone that I've talked to who has been, all of their trainers in Iran are Venezuelans working under the direct leadership of Mohsen Rabbani, who planned the 1994 Amia bombing. So I think that yes, I don't think they're getting massive conversions, and I don't think they're going to. But there's a concerted effort to make themselves less other in the world. And what's really interesting is that these guys will go, some of them will go to Iran for 3 months, some will go for 3 years. And no one keeps track of when they come back. And so, and the people I talk to, some have been trained in crowd control, some have been trained in how to instigate crowds into violent action, some in how to carry out basic intelligence operations, some basic counterintelligence, make sure you're not followed, that kind of stuff. What happens to those people and now it's been going on since at least 2006. There's multiple hundreds of people who have gone through the Iranian program. We know nothing about it as far as I know, even on the classified side where I work and I've looked. And it's something that the host governments certainly don't pay any attention to, and we pay very little attention to. And that's the type of thing I think that can set the stage for damage being done.
We have another question from Jim Franklin. I don't know where he works. Quote, Director of National Intelligence Clapper said today before Congress that the intelligence community is not exactly sure how Assad is financing the civil war. Is there any evidence regarding the use of organized crime methods by the regime, taking into consideration Hezbollah's involvement in the fighting? I can start with that if anybody wants to follow after me. One way that Assad is financing the civil war is Moscow. We know of many flights that have taken place from Moscow to Damascus with flights full of sacks of money to the Syrian government, allowing the Syrian government to finance the civil war. And incidentally, yesterday, Moscow made the charge that Afghan drug money is financing the rebels. Now, that's a self-serving charge, even though it may be true. But we do know that you have at least one state, probably Iran also, is financing Assad as well. Now, whether or not there's any organized criminal activity, does anybody have any information?
Well, we know that Chavez was sending diesel regularly to him. It's different from money, but it was badly needed fuel. That was a matter of public record. And when he was caught, he said, you know, screw you, I can send diesel to whoever I want. I would guess, given the flows of money that were documented in the Operation Titan, which were in the hundreds of millions of dollars, that Hezbollah could certainly aid if they were asked to in that. But I don't know directly. I don't know for sure.
Ed, do you have any information?
No.
Karen?
I just know what you knew.
Okay. Sir.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Moussa Diop from the Senegalese Army, and I would like to respectfully submit a different perspective on the flow of arms into the African continent. But I'll limit myself to Western Africa. I think that you might have given a too large and meaningful characterization of airborne illicit arms coming into the continent. the issue of arms in Africa is related to small arms. We used to say that the most sophisticated weapon in that environment is the RPG-7. So it's not an issue of acquiring weapons from the outside, because you have a constant pool of weapons that is being shifted from theater to theater. And if you have to track it back, it goes back obviously to the Cold War and those types of proxy wars between, the Soviets and the West, and insurgencies in Angola, in Biafra, and so on. You also have weapons supplied by Muammar Gaddafi in the context of the Chadian conflicts, and so on and so on. The most recent case, actually, the most recent source of weapons is Libya. And my point is, it's not an issue of illicit trafficking, because the Tuareg that you mentioned earlier, there used to be regiments within Gaddafi's army. So when Gaddafi fell, they just left Libya with women and weapons and everything into Mali and outpowered the government forces. Another point I would like to make is about when you characterize it as illicit, I wonder against what regulation? Because it's an open market. I will give you the example of the Senegalese government. We recently purchased Mi-35 helicopters, Mi-17, from Belarus. We did it in an open way because it's cheap, it's good for our needs. We don't have money enough we could not afford Apache helicopters. That's the reason why we go to Belarus to acquire helicopters. And again, it's not meaningful. It's not meaningful, and it does not have a significant impact on conflicts in Africa. And again, consider the cost of transferring weapons through air from Belarus. The cost of the transfer would exceed the value of the weapons. And again, you mentioned Cameroon. I wonder who in Cameroon would purchase illicit arms. And illicit arms through air means, because they have seaports, like Cameroon, they have Douala, they have Yaoundé. You can ship weapons freely using sea assets. So there is no need actually to go that way of illicit airborne, means to acquire weapons. You don't need to, because conflicts remain very low in terms of technology. You don't need to go that way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You bring up a lot of good points. First of all, I don't think that that it's mutually exclusive that there is illicit arms trade into Africa and there are weapons circulating Africa at the same time. Also, there have been some successful buyback programs that have lessened some of the weapons circulating around Africa. But the Cameroon connection, the fact that there's a timber export company registered and operating out of Cameroon that is paying for arms coming into Africa doesn't mean the arms are coming into Cameroon. These are, I think we all need to stop looking at this as a state-to-state affair. These are illicit trade networks that are pernicious and operating across the continent. So you may have a delivery somewhere and a payment of timber from somewhere else coming through a company in Cameroon. It doesn't mean that it's the arms settled in Cameroon and were paid for out of Cameroon. I hope that distinction is clear. Your question about what is illicit. Yes, I understand that there is licit arms trade for Senegal from Belarus. However, what I'm discussing is the trade in arms to illicitly operating networks in Africa. So it is illicit trade. These are embargoed governments, for example, embargoed by the UN or the European Union, or they are hostile non-state actor groups. They are opposition factors, rebel forces, they could be terrorist organizations and the like. So this is not illicit state-to-state transfers. This is illicit trade in weapons to non-state actor groups. or embargoed dictators.
Can I just add one thing briefly? The only thing Victor Boot liked in my book was when I said that most of what he did was morally reprehensible but not illegal. And I think that that is a fundamental bottom line, because ultimately he was trying to sell weapons to who he thought was the FARC to kill Americans. That was what got him. But what was fascinating was the only sanction against him was the UN sanctions list. And when the UN places an arms embargo on it and you fly weapons in, what does the UN do? Oh my God, you flew weapons in. Gee, please don't do that again, or we'll get really, really mad. And that's the extent of the sanctions. So yes, there are many, many ways, there are many cases where and I think that the new UN arms law that just passed last week is an attempt to address this arms flow in a significant way, because that's the lowest hanging fruit. I mean, to get an end user certificate, you can write it on toilet paper. There's no standardized method. And I'll just be very brief. When I was tracking Boots Network, flying out of Togo, he had end user certificates from Togo. Togo for buying, I think it was 15,000 AKs and 4 million rounds of ammunition, all kind of stuff. Togo has an army of what? 5,000, 7,000, always French. The person selling the weapons in Bulgaria did not have to say to himself, that's a strange thing. Maybe I should call up the Minister of Defense. Because if he called up the Minister of Defense, he'd find that the minister who signed the end-user certificate had been dead for 2 years. Okay? There's no due diligence requirements on the company. So in the end, everyone did everything wrong and no one was guilty of anything. And it was this amazing thing at the end of the day, like, that's it. That's how it works, and that's why it works. Karen?
And I did also want to address your question about the cost of providing illicit arms trade by air. Costs are lessened dramatically when you're flying barely airworthy, broken down Soviet Ilyushins or Tupolovs that you bought for $20,000 from an airfield where your buddy works, first of all. Second of all, costs are reduced when you're relying on Soviet aviators who will, and I can document this, work for $500 a month in Africa from UAE locations. And third, your costs are significantly reduced in fuel when you work out of Kyrgyzstan, where we have Manas Transit Center. I'll stop my comments on Manas there.
Okay. We have a question from Professor Lawrence Hinson of the University of Oklahoma. I believe that's the last question. No? Okay. Quote, please comment on bi- or multinational efforts with Israel, Arab countries, or other relevant partners. What are the overlaps, or are there any collective efforts in combating state-sponsored crime and non-state actors? Anybody want to take that?
I might just mention on Israel that there's a certain difficulty in Israel that the Mr. Lieberman, the foreign minister, who to some extent oversees Israel's cooperation, is also under, I think, has just been indicted for organized crime charges.
Former foreign minister. The new government, he's not in there.
Former foreign, yeah. But he was serving when there was a cloud of suspicion over him, which.
I know that Israel is monitoring the Iranian activities very closely, and Hezbollah, because it's in their own self-interest, and I know that we do share information and talk with them. On the Arab side, I don't know of any sort of overlapping, ongoing cooperative issues with them on those issues.
Any more questions? Sir.
Hi, Art Lawyer. I'm from Northcom, and Doug kind of already knows this because we've worked together. But I mean, the theme of the conference is land power, and the combatant commands are the ones that give kind of the requirements to the services. And one of the challenges that we've had in Northcom, and so has in Southcom, is us being able to justify land forces in order to combat transnational organized crime and criminal organizations. And we've been working on this for quite some time now, and part of it, I think, is how we were labeling things. So when we talked about this a little earlier, just in this group alone, we've called them arms trafficking networks, we've called them criminal networks, there's terrorist networks, there's money laundering networks. They're all networks. They're threat networks. And when we label these things, inevitably in the Department of Defense, all these little groups are formed. The terrorist group, the illicit arms trafficking group, the transnational criminal organization group, and they all have different authorities, they have different funding sites, they have their own little meetings, and it's stovepiped. And at no time does anybody get together and really understand what the nature of the problem is. What's the threat? What's its center of gravity? Where is its vulnerabilities? What are the capabilities that you need to put against it? Moreover, the State Department, you know, they're also limited with their authorities as well, and when we label something criminal, military's not involved in it. It's a law enforcement issue. So we can provide support through the State Department to help our partner nations train, but if you look at Mexico, and if you look at a lot of the Central American states, it's their militaries that are the ones dealing with the criminal organizations. And in Mexico, Sedena and Samar don't necessarily want to work with DEA and FBI. They want to work with the U.S. military. So that's the conundrum we face, and a lot of it started because of labels. And if we can just control ourselves with all the different acronyms, maybe we can understand the nature of the threat. I'd like to get y'all's feedback on that. Thank you.
Let me start, and then anybody wants. You know, if you remember a few years back, we had this big explosion of interest in what we called network-centric warfare. What we're dealing with, in a sense, are networks and network-centric threats, if you like. And the point that we talked about network-centric warfare is that it was self-synchronizing, you know, that units will be able to act on their own through the medium of information technology. Well, bureaucratically, we're still organized bureaucratically rather than, as you say, in networks. And I think what this points to in terms of land power is not just a question of jointness, but of networks. Because, again, Treasury, Intel, land power, police authorities of various stripes, depending on the nature of what we're discussing, and so on, all have to come together and share information. And it has to, and those stovepipes have to be broken down. And what this may mean is that in dealing with these kinds of threats in the future, it's not just a question of land power as we think about it in the traditional sense that, you know, Battalion 1 marches out and occupies the ground and clears the area and so on, but that you have a networked operation involving elements of land, maybe naval, air, intel, Treasury, FBI, whatever, collaborating together, and that the mantra of jointness must be pushed into that kind of direction, at least at that level of threat. Now, that's just my personal take. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but it strikes me as this because we're dealing with a new phenomenon. 14 years ago, the Chinese wrote a book called Unrestricted Warfare. Everything I've heard this afternoon sounds like it was taken out of that book. That, you know, Chavez was doing it, his successors will try, and others will come along and do it. And we have to respond, as Ed has said, in ways that are not bureaucratic. And as Karen said, we have to break the box, period. So,
I agree as well. I think that you know, the network analysis is, we've learned the words now, we haven't learned the actions. We can say that, it's like telling me to do something on a computer. I understand what each word means. I don't know how to make a computer work that way. And I think that that's sort of the way we are bureaucratically. And I think that it's to our own detriment because I think one of the things I've learned doing a lot of war games in the last few years is the whole issue of authorities. You know, our authorities are so many decades behind what we need them to be, and there's no movement to make them more functional in the world that we're facing, that we're really I think in a difficulty in that sense too. But I think that, you know, the efforts between Northcom, Southcom, SOCOM on the Mexico, Central America issue is, you know, a way, I think that you're finding ways to break those barriers, and I think that that's out of necessity, and I think it's good. I think it can be I don't deal with much of the rest of the world, so I'm not sure what's going on elsewhere, but I think that there are ways, and I think a lot of it comes down, as you well know, to the individuals in leadership positions being willing to push that. And if they're not, it's not going to happen, and if they are, it can happen. And the people on the ground who have to work with each other. If I don't like this guy, and he's FBI, screw the FBI. If we get along really well, boom, off we go. You know, we do great things together. So it's because it's not institutionalized, it comes down to personalities, and that's dangerous.
Ed?
Yes, just very briefly, I wanted to add that I think one place where US land power has a very important effect is in the psychological sphere. And it was quite interesting that in particularly if you've got states where the state structures are a bit weak and there's perhaps a danger of weak morale in law enforcement and other bits of government. Knowing that the alliance with America is strong and is back and has a real military component, actually has quite a transformative effect. I was talking to Baltic officials about the effect of NATO membership, and they said that it actually had quite a good effect on the organized crime front, because it just made people think these states are permanent. America is willing to defend these countries which regained their independence only in 1991. Actually, we don't have to be as scared of Russian mafia any more than we have to be scared of the Russian state, because we have air police, NATO air policing flying overhead. And it sounds sort of a bit of a stretch, but having lived in the Baltic states, I think it's actually true.
Okay, we have to end there. Please join me with a round of applause for what I think was a superb panel.
Thank you. If I could ask the panel, Steve, your panel definitely lived up to the expectation. I appreciate that, to end on a real strong note. If I could ask the panel to join us in the audience, the Commandant will have the closing remarks without break.
That's right, no break. And panelists, you don't have to move if you don't want to. Listen, well, after that panel, I'll tell you what, combination of depressed and motivated. And I'll tell you though, honest, I have, over the last 48 hours, I've learned so much from a really, really fine conference. But for this particular topic, what we're going to do, and I know Doug Campbell is not in the audience, but Doug Lovelace, we're gonna have a transnational criminal organization war game. For those of you not familiar with it, we turned the wargaming capability that was focused on the students here at the United States Army War College into a wargaming capability that is focused on the geographic combatant commanders and also the United States Army. So we would say things, I have written letters to geographic combatant commanders that said, give me a complex problem you want to work on. We've actually had one combatant commander come back and say, I need you to work on this because it is politically unpalatable for me to be working on it. And so we've been turning war games every 6 weeks. They've been very interesting, and this is a great topic to pick up. And what we do is we keep at the strategic level. So you were talking about the authorities and such that stymie us. What policies are archaic? What's in the way of getting after this problem, which is only getting worse, clearly, from our learned panel? I appreciate that. It was very well done. So all I want to do very briefly is thank you very much. I want to thank, if anybody is still on the web, I want to thank you very much for tuning in, for sending your questions, for listening. For the folks here, thank you for staying through. I think it's been a fantastic conference. I would ask the folks here, if you would, we're really interested in feedback. 24th conference doesn't mean we can't make 25 even better. So please fill out the questionnaire. If you're online, we're going to post something for you to fill out if you would look to that, and we welcome your comments online anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, the United States Army War College lives to do this. This is our purpose. Our purpose is to pause, think, confer, discuss, hear all ideas as we arm future national security professionals to become strategic leaders and advisors in this tough world, but also advance our knowledge at this level. We have very, very busy and capable national leaders who don't have the time to do what we've done over the last 48 hours. And so our mission now is to leave the conference and think some more, study some more, write if you can, blog if you can, keep the relationships going, and let's keep the discussion lively, vibrant, and relevant. I thank you very much for your personal attention and energy, and you are all welcome back to the United States Army War College, physically or virtually, anytime. This concludes the conference.